The Shadow Throne, the secret society that controlled European kings for 300 years. What if I told you that the most powerful kings in European history were not actually in control? What if the crowns, the thrones, the wars, the treaties, and the marriages that shaped our entire modern world were orchestrated not by monarchs, but by a hidden network of shadowy advisors who answered to no nation, no church, and no god but power itself? For centuries, this was hidden from the world. Tonight, we pull back the curtain. Welcome back to Historical Secrets. What you are about to hear is one of the most suppressed and overlooked chapters in European history. It involves a brotherhood so secretive that even speaking its name could get you executed in certain courts. It involves manipulation at the highest levels of government, religion, and war. And it involves a trail of evidence that historians have deliberately ignored for generations. The truth was buried for a reason. But tonight, we dig it up. To understand this story, we need to travel back to the late 15th century, a time when Europe was fracturing. The Catholic Church was losing its grip. The Protestant Reformation was brewing. Empires were rising and collapsing. And in the chaos, a new kind of power was being born, not on battlefields, but in private chambers, sealed letters and whispered conversations behind locked doors. In 1489, a group of influential advisors, financiers, and scholars gathered in a villa outside Florence, Italy. They were connected to the Medici family, but operated independently of them. They called themselves the Concilium Umbrarum, the Council of Shadows. Their mission was breathtakingly ambitious. They believed that kings were too emotional, too reckless, and too short-sighted to rule effectively. And so they decided in that candlelit room in Tuscany that they would rule instead, not by sitting on thrones, but by controlling the men who did. What historians don't tell you is that this was not some fringe group of dreamers. These were men who already held extraordinary influence. Among the founding members were papal financial advisors, Venetian trade magnates, and at least two figures directly connected to the Spanish court of Ferdinand and Isabella. They had wealth, they had connections, and most importantly, they had a method. The Concilium operated through a system they called the Three Pillars. The first pillar was financial dependency. They would loan enormous sums to monarchs funding wars and expansion, creating debts so vast that kings became financially enslaved to the council without ever realizing they had a master. The second pillar was strategic marriage. By influencing which royal families intermarried, they could shape alliances, succession lines, and the future political map of an entire continent, sometimes decades in advance. The third pillar was the most chilling of all. They called it the whisper. Every major European court would have at least one member of the Concilium embedded as a trusted advisor, a confessor, a tutor to the royal children, or a court physician. These agents would guide royal decisions from the inside, slowly, carefully, invisibly. The evidence for their influence is scattered across history, hiding in plain sight. Consider the strange case of the Habsburg dynasty. How did one family come to control Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, and vast territories across Europe simultaneously? Mainstream history credits clever diplomacy and fortunate marriages. But when you trace the financial backing behind those marriages, when you examine who arranged the unions and who profited from them, the same network of names keeps appearing. Names connected to banking houses in Florence, Venice, and later Augsburg. Names that appear in private correspondence sealed with a symbol historians have long dismissed as a merchant's mark, a serpent coiled around a broken crown. That symbol has been found in documents spanning 3 centuries. It appears in the margins of a 1520 letter between advisors to Charles V of Spain. It was stamped on financial ledgers discovered in a Venetian archive in 1887, ledgers that were promptly sealed and not reopened until 2004. And most disturbingly, it was found carved into a hidden compartment in the desk of Cardinal Richelieu, the man who essentially ran France from behind the throne of Louis XIII. Richelieu is perhaps the most visible example of the Concilium's influence. Here was a man who was technically a servant of the king, but wielded more power than any monarch in Europe. He crushed internal dissent, manipulated foreign wars, and reshaped France into a centralized powerhouse. Historians celebrate him as a political genius, but private letters discovered in a Parisian estate sale in 1971 suggest Richelieu was receiving strategic guidance from an external network, a network he referred to only as our friends in the long shadow. This changes everything we thought we knew about the balance of power in early modern Europe. The 30 Years' War, which devastated Central Europe and killed an estimated 8 million people, has long been framed as a conflict of religion and politics. But financial records show that both Protestant and Catholic sides were funded by interconnected banking interests. The same families were financing armies on opposite sides of the battlefield. The war was not merely a tragedy, it was an instrument. It weakened monarchies, destroyed the old feudal order, and created a new Europe where financial power mattered more than bloodlines. And that was exactly what the Concilium wanted. Their reach extended even to England. When you examine the English Civil War and the eventual execution of Charles I in 1649, you find a curious pattern. Key parliamentary figures who pushed for the king's trial had financial connections to continental banking networks. Oliver Cromwell's rise to power was funded in part by loans whose origins trace back to the same clusters of families that had been operating since the Florence meeting of 1489. The Concilium did not care about Protestantism or Catholicism, Parliament or crown. They cared about control. And when a king could not be controlled, he was removed. The Council of Shadows appears to have reached its peak influence during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, a period when Europe was being reshaped by the wars of Louis XIV, the rise of the British Empire, and the slow decline of Spain. By the time of the French Revolution in 1789, roughly 300 years after the founding meeting, the Concilium had either dissolved or evolved into something else entirely. Some researchers believe its members merged into the early Freemason lodges that were spreading across Europe. Others believe the network simply adapted, abandoning the old aristocratic model and embedding itself into the emerging world of constitutional governments and central banking. What we know for certain is this: the serpent and broken crown symbol disappears from the historical record after approximately 1795. The banking families connected to the network either died out, merged with larger institutions, or went underground so completely that tracing them becomes nearly impossible. But the architecture of control they built, financial dependency, strategic alliances, and invisible advisors shaping policy from within, does that sound familiar? Because it should. It is the blueprint for how power still operates today. The next time you read about a war that seemed to benefit no one, a political alliance that made no sense, or a leader who suddenly reversed course on a critical decision, ask yourself a question. Who was whispering in their ear? Who held their debts? And who truly benefited from the outcome? For centuries, the Concilium Umbrarum operated in total darkness. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is not that they existed. It is that we still do not know with absolute certainty that they ever stopped. Now, if this story sent chills down your spine, you are not ready for what comes next. In our next episode, we investigate the lost archive of the Vatican, a sealed underground library that reportedly contains confessions, prophecies, and documents so dangerous that 3 popes ordered them destroyed. And yet someone made sure they survived. You do not want to miss that one. Subscribe to Historical Secrets right now, hit that notification bell, and join the millions who refuse to accept the version of history they were told to believe. The truth is out there. We just have to be brave enough to find it.